Okay, great. So yeah, as I was saying, we all have a role to play in being active bystanders in situations where through our own actions, we can actually prevent sexual violence from happening in the first place. So today, I hope to equip you with the basic tools of being an active bystander, kind of just in hopes that you will work to use them in your daily life to prevent sexual misconduct, violence, assault, and any cases where you might find yourself with the unique ability to be able to do so. So just briefly, I wanted to reiterate why this topic is important for all of us, for you as an individual to learn about. And just to give you an idea of the magnitude of the issue we're dealing with, 1 in 3 women and 1 in 6 men will experience sexual violence at some point in their lifetime. So if we just think about our own lives for a second and do a little bit of reflection, that means that all of us knows at least one person who has experienced sexual violence or who will at some point in the future, right? And so as responsible community members, loved ones, caregivers, humans just in general, it is our duty to learn to act in ways which are supportive to survivors and act in ways which can work to prevent these instances from happening going forward. So sexual violence affects all of us. It is all of our duty to be competent in this field of interest and do what we can to try and reduce its incidence. Before we get into being an active bystander and what that means, I want to quickly go over the definitions of sexual violence versus sexual assault, because these two terms are often conflated with each other and they are in fact very different things. So I'll just read this verbatim for you. Sexual violence means any sexual act or act targeting a person's sexuality, gender identity, or gender expression, whether the act is physical or psychological in nature, that is committed, threatened, or attempted against a person without that person's consent. And it includes acts like sexual assault, sexual harassment, stalking, indecent exposure, voyeurism, and sexual exploitation. So I know that was kind of a big, long-winded definition, so I'll break it down into kind of smaller parts for you. So sexual violence is essentially any act that targets somebody's sexuality, gender identity without their consent. And I want to point out that although we generally think of violence as a physical act, sexual violence can be a lot more implicit, right? It doesn't need to necessarily involve touching. So things like sexual harassment, indecent exposure, more often than not, these things don't involve us touching somebody or being very aggressively violent with somebody, right? But they are still considered to be sexually violent. Sexual assault, on the other hand, is any physical contact or behavior which is sexual in nature that is committed without explicit consent of the complainant. This includes forced sexual intercourse, unwanted fondling, kissing, or touching, and this is a crime. So sexual assault is a form of sexual violence. Sexual violence is this big umbrella term that covers lots of different acts. Sexual assault, much more narrow in scope, and it does include what we refer to as rape, but it is broader in scope than just rape. It is including unwanted kissing and sexual touching, not these things. So I hope that that distinction there makes sense to folks, that sexual violence is much broader than sexual assault is. So like we just said, sexual violence, big umbrella term, covers lots of different acts, and these acts exist on a continuum that goes from risky sexual behavior, so the bubbles in green on the left, all the way to criminal behavior, so the blue bubbles on the right. These risky acts that we see here in green are acts which, although are incredibly unwanted and offensive and totally inappropriate, cannot result in criminal charges. As we kind of move to the middle there, acts like stalking, indecent exposure, Sometimes these acts can result in criminal charges, but more often than not, they result in a restraining order or some sort of mediation that goes on. And then as we go to the far right of the spectrum, we see our acts of sexual assault, right, which can result in criminal charges. These acts are what I think most people would probably consider the worst forms of sexual violence, things like rape and unwanted kissing and fondling. But I want to make it very clear to folks that each of these acts on the continuum are equally worthy of preventing and fighting against. Because the fact is that it's the normalization and the perpetuation of the risky acts that pave the way for things like sexual assault to occur. They create what we call rape culture, a culture where we normalize unwanted sexual attention, where we become desensitized to the very real harm that each of these acts can cause. And when we do that, we often tend to start to put the onus on vulnerable populations to protect themselves, rather than putting the onus on perpetrators to not harm other people, right? So now that we have a little bit of a thorough understanding of what sexual violence is and kind of the acts that are involved and how all of these things are equally worthy of fighting against, let's talk a little bit about how we can actually work to interrupt, challenge, prevent all of these acts from occurring. So when we are faced with, or when we witness potentially dangerous or risky situations, we all have two options for how we're going to respond. Either we're going to see that situation unfolding and we're going to choose not to do something, or we're going to see it and take responsibility for contributing to a positive outcome. We're going to act in the best interest of the victim and try to help them out, right? So those who choose to do nothing are what we call apathetic bystanders. And those who do act are what we call active bystanders. And that's who we want to be. Now, whether you choose to act or not in various circumstances can be based on a lot of different things, right? Like your own personal safety is a factor. Maybe the number of people that you have around you to support you is a factor of whether you're going to step in. But more often than not, there is always something that we can do. Even if it's just a very small thing, there's always something we can do to contribute to a positive outcome for victims or potential victims. So how can we do this? What are these steps to being an active bystander? There are 5 main steps. The first one is to notice the event. So you can't do anything about it if you don't know that it's happening. You have to interpret the event as problematic. So you have to know what to look for. You need to know what those signs of risky behavior or dangerous behavior are. And this kind of goes back to what I was speaking about before with the continuum, where acts like catcalling, rape jokes, voyeurism, all of these things, they often get swept under the rug in our society and in our communities. We generally don't see those things as very harmful or offensive. But part of being an active bystander is recognizing that those things are harmful and are offensive, and we do need to interpret those things as problematic in order to intervene. The third step is assuming personal responsibility. So you have to take personal responsibility for the safety and well-being of another person. Now, you never do this above your own personal safety. Your own well-being is number one priority. But in cases where it's safe to do so, you need to take responsibility for helping somebody else out, essentially. The fourth step is you have to know how to help. So you have to have the tools. And then you have to actually act on those tools and act safely. So the tools of bystander intervention are the 4 Ds. And so they are direct, distract, delegate, delay. I'm going to share a little bit of a case study, I suppose, with you, just so that we can clearly illustrate how each of these tools might be put into action. So this is an example that I often share with post-secondary students or high school students, because Lots of them may have found themselves in a similar situation recently, but I'll use it with you as well, because I think all of us can probably relate to this scenario. So I want you to imagine that you are at a party, a house party with your friends, or an informal work get together with your friends, and you're all drinking and dancing and having a good time. And you notice that one of your friends is being slowly moved off to a more secluded area by a person that you don't recognize. And so there's this like main hall, imagine, where everybody's dancing, and you see your friend kind of getting dragged off to the sidelines where they're not visible anymore. And you know that they've been drinking. You don't know if this other person that's dragging them away has been drinking. You just get that feeling in your stomach, like those butterflies, that something is wrong and that this shouldn't be happening, that you need to keep an eye on your friend. And so in this situation, what could you do to intervene and prevent something potentially very serious from happening? The first thing you could do is be direct. So direct means be direct. That could look like going up and physically confronting the situation, going up to your friend and this other individual and saying, I don't feel comfortable with you taking my friend off to this isolated location, so we're going to go back to the main room now. Or saying things like, I see this behavior happening, this makes me uncomfortable for these reasons, and so I'm going to have to separate my friend from you right now. Now, this is a very effective strategy, very assertive, and in more cases than not, it will result in a positive outcome because you are physically separating the two parties, right? So nothing bad can happen then. But this isn't always a safe strategy, right? And you might not always feel comfortable being so assertive and direct with somebody, especially if you don't know them, especially if you fear for your own personal safety if you do so. So when you can't be direct, you can distract. This is my favorite strategy. I use it all the time. And distract means essentially distracting from the situation that you're concerned about, putting the focus somewhere else, ultimately with the goal of physically separating the two parties. So this might look like I spill a drink on myself and I go to my friend who's being dragged off and I say, oh my gosh, I spilled this drink all over me. Can you come to the washroom with me to help me wash up? Or saying, I'm kind of tired, I'm not feeling well. Will you split an Uber to go home with me? Will you walk me home? We're playing a game in the main room. Do you want to come play this game with us? Let's go play. Things like that allow you to physically separate the two parties without actually causing a scene or putting your own personal safety at risk. It's much more subtle. And at the end of the day, you achieve the same thing. You achieve separating the two parties and making sure that nobody gets hurt. The third D is delegate. So this means asking others for help. Sometimes we're in situations where we don't feel comfortable being direct or causing a distraction by ourselves. So in this particular scenario that I've laid out for you, you're at this party with your friends. And so maybe you go up to your friends and you ask, hey, like I see this happening and this is making me a bit uncomfortable. Would you mind addressing this with me, causing a distraction or going to talk to them? Even if you're not with your friends and you're somewhere all alone with maybe only one other person, or you see a stranger that might be in danger, more often than not, strangers are good people and do have the best interest of other humans in mind. So even if you just go up to somebody that you don't know and say, I'm uncomfortable with this situation, would you mind helping me out? They're probably going to help you, right? So remember that there's always more power, strength, and safety in numbers. And so using this delegation technique to be able to employ direct or distract can be very helpful. And the last D is delay. So sometimes we are in these situations where we see something happening that we know is wrong, but we just can't do anything to prevent it. Maybe our own personal safety is at risk, or we're very, very uncomfortable intervening in this. And that's okay. Like, I never want anybody to feel guilty or bad or like it was their fault for not being able to prevent something from happening. Ultimately, your own well-being always comes first. But even if you couldn't prevent something from happening, you can still support that victimized person afterwards, right? You can be there to be a supportive, validating source. You can be there to listen to them, help them access resources in the community if they so desire to do so. Just being there for a victim to say, I believe you, I am sorry that this happened to you, you did not deserve this, it was not your fault. All of those things, intervening after the fact with the victim will mean the absolute world to them. Okay, so those are the main strategies to being an active bystander. And I've used a very specific example here because, usually I do this workshop on sexual violence specifically, but I hope you can appreciate that these steps can be used for intervening in just about anything. If someone made a rape joke or an insensitive comment, if someone's being mistreated at work, if you notice somebody following another person home, all of these tools will apply, and they have actually been proven to reduce the incidence of violent crimes in areas where this type of training is widespread. There is statistical significance behind the impact of this training on the well-being and safety of wider communities. So I really encourage you, if you want to take a picture of this slide or you just want to take some notes and have it in your back pocket, I really encourage you to, when you can and when it's appropriate, to enlist some of these strategies and just see, what positive outcome comes from it. And never underestimate your ability to help a victimized person, to help protect a potentially victimized person, and ultimately to keep your community safe. So that's all I have for you today. Thank you for having me again. I hope that this was educational and helpful. And I know that this topic can be quite difficult to digest and talk about. So if you feel compelled to do so, I encourage you to reach out to the Toronto Rape Crisis Center. They provide a hotline where you can receive fantastic, non-judgmental, confidential support from people who are trained in trauma-informed care. And likewise, you can use my email there if you'd like to debrief or just to learn more about sexual violence or bystander intervention. Typically, this is a 1.5 to 2 hour training that I provide. Sometimes I do full day trainings for businesses and whatnot. So I certainly have a lot more information to share if you are interested. But that's all I have. So thank you for listening.
Okay, do we have questions?
So Lexi, could you stop sharing your screen and then we can see everybody? Perfect. Thank you.
Questions?
No.
Art?
No.
Okay, I have a question.
Sure.
You do these presentations a lot in schools.
Yeah.
How do students respond to this? Does this seem like news to them, or is it things that they're familiar with?
Yeah, so it's interesting because most students have never had any sort of education on this. In the curriculum as it stands right now, there is like no talk of sexual violence, sexual assault, bystander intervention. In many cases, there's not even really a large piece on consent, which was shocking for me to hear. And so most of the time I go into these environments with students who are very eager and willing to learn, because especially for high school folks, many of them have already experienced a form of sexual violence or sexual assault. Many of them go to parties and see these instances happening and don't know how to help. They don't know how to intervene. And so I'm always pleasantly surprised at how engaged they are in these workshops, because this is real life education that they don't get a lot of the time. These are the tools that they will 100% use if they go to college or university or just in the world in general, right? I think it's such a shame that schools provide university preparation in terms of academic preparation, but none of this real life being a good human and a responsible human sort of education. So to answer your question, no, usually they haven't heard any of this before, and they are always very receptive and always have lots of questions and positive feedback. And this is kind of illustrated by the fact that I almost always get invited back every year to do these workshops for the new students coming into the school, or for the little ones as well, workshops on just body safety and consent and whatnot. So yeah, it's really great work to be able to do, to know that I can provide these kids with an opportunity to keep themselves and others safe. It's really great.
Great.
Virginia.
What I find interesting is that it was such a short little tight presentation, but yet I think it had, there's a lot of meaning and actionability to it. So thank you, Lexi.
Yeah, no worries.
I've got another question, actually. There was a story in the paper a couple of days ago about men getting fired from their jobs. And in one instance, a man had been a long-term employee of, I don't know what company. Anyway, at some social event, he grabbed or patted a woman on the backside. She put in a complaint. He was fired. He went to court claiming wrongful dismissal, and the court turned him down. And even though it was one instance for a long-term employee, he was out. But it made me think that couldn't be just, first of all, I think we all have to be careful. But I think the other thing too is that couldn't have been just a one-off incident. There must have been a culture, I would think, in that company in which this sort of behavior was considered acceptable.
Yeah, absolutely. Oftentimes when we investigate cases like that, or when I support people, like I work with trauma survivors to help with their healing journey and stuff. And oftentimes I hear stories of that, like of women who experience that kind of unwanted attention or touching in the workplace. And, there are generally policies in place about poisoned work environments, right? And how dating your boss, for example, creates a poisoned work environment, or talking about your sex life with your boss is a poisoned work environment. But oftentimes it doesn't include those smaller acts like that have very real harmful impacts on folks. But unfortunately, as a society, we haven't quite gotten to the point where most people recognize that as very harmful and unacceptable to do. And I think you're right. A lot of work environments don't do a good enough job of creating safe spaces for people of all gender identities, all gender expressions. And it does create cases like that where people can continuously get away with these actions until somebody is strong enough to speak up.
Tara.
Sorry, I was just going to say, it reminded me of a story, a workplace that I was at. And there was a gentleman who made an inappropriate, actually, it didn't just happen once. There was an inappropriate remark a couple of times, which was, again, like kind of questionable, And once there was this one of his peers, a guy who was about the same age, maybe a little bit older. And he went, dude, not cool. And it never happened again. And it was to the point where I was talking to one of the girls in accounting who was kind of the target of the remarks. And she told me after, because I was kind of impressed with this guy for doing that, because it just shut it right down. And she said to me, you know what, I was actually considering going to HR, and I don't need to. So that's the difference between like a healthy workplace where someone feels that they can, call that behavior out, and maybe a workplace that has relied on, that kind of negative behavior. So it was really great to see it just turned around so quickly, right? Because one person had the confidence to shut it down. And then it kind of told all the women there, like, it's not acceptable. You don't have to put up with that. So it reminded me, your story about reading that newspaper reminded me of seeing it.
Yeah, absolutely. That perfectly illustrates the power of the active bystander, right? Like seeing something like that at inappropriate remark and recognizing that as inappropriate and then doing something to shut it down. I think, and also like, I don't like thinking of it this way, but it is true that oftentimes men, when they make remarks like that or have these actions, are more likely to listen to a man who shuts them down versus a woman who shuts them down. It's not a great reality, but it is a reality, right? And so that's why I am so passionate about bringing everybody into this conversation. And, you know, when I do these workshops, I don't gender them in any way or paint anybody as a perpetrator or a bad person, because that ultimately is unhelpful. You know, pinning two groups against each other in hopes that somebody's going to come to a commonality or want to be part of the solution is just never going to work. So I think it's important that we provide these conversations to everybody. It's not just like a woman's responsibility to be able to recognize these things and protect themselves. It's on men as well to want to be part of the change and want to stand by other folks in the community who might be targeted. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. It's a great story.
It is the same, I don't know, but is it likely that the same is true for females as well? That if a female calls out another female for saying or doing something inappropriate, they're more likely to listen or not? It's sort of a question.
I honestly don't have like a scientific answer for you on that. If I had to guess though, just from what I know about power dynamics and whatnot, I would say that wouldn't be true. I think women are, just because of how many of us have grown up in a society where largely men are in positions of power. We don't, until recently, see a lot of women in positions of power. We're kind of trained to take direction from men a lot more seriously than direction from women. So that would be my guess. But just a hunch.
Lynn,
Hi, Lexi. I have a question about the schools. Am I right in saying that you're invited into specific schools to do these workshops? Is that right?
What's that? Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, I'm sorry that you're invited into specific schools to do these workshops. I'm wondering, is there anything in any kind of curriculum that's covered on this topic?
So yeah, I do get invited to schools to talk about this. And from what I've gathered from most of the schools that I've been to, there is nothing on sexual violence in the curriculum as it stands. And that's why they bring in an outside source to talk about it. And I think too, it helps that I'm a person that is not a teacher or somebody that knows the kids and is kind of in their business every day, because they're not going to be as open to asking questions and sharing certain stories and stuff if they're sharing it with their math teacher or their health teacher, right? Like it's a very different dynamic, and it's just a lot more productive, I think, when you have kind of an anonymous outside source to ask questions to, that, you know, that information is never going to get back to your teachers or your parents or the faculty or anything like that. So I think there are a number of reasons why schools invite me to do these talks outside of just the curriculum issue. I think also some teachers just don't feel comfortable talking about a topic that they're not well versed in and that they might not be able to answer all the questions appropriately. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. I guess the thing is though that it means that's still reaching a very limited number of people.
What's that?
I think it means it's still reaching a limited amount of high school children, right? If it's by your group, or probably there's some others doing something similar, but it can't be reaching a huge amount of people.
Yeah, it's true. And it's hard. Like I started doing this work independently about 2 years ago. Previously, I worked at Queen's University for them doing work for their students and their faculty on prevention. But I started doing this independently not that long ago. And so it is difficult sometimes, you know, finding schools who first are willing to have somebody come in, and schools who can, I don't know how to put it, like, I guess the outreach is difficult sometimes, especially because you do have certain schools with vocal parent groups who might not want their kids to learn about this topic even before they've even seen the workshop and seen what's being taught. I think a lot of parents have like reservations about their kids learning about anything to do with sex in general, let alone sexual violence and that kind of stuff. But, you know, really the workshops are not about digging into these people's own experiences or anything. It's about teaching them the tools to keep each other safe, ultimately, is what it is, right? So you're right. The reach is quite small right now, but I hope eventually to get it to a larger scale. That's the goal.
Thank you.
Okay, Art, I'm going to call on you to thank our speaker.
Hey, Lexi, I want to thank you for your insightful, thoughtful, and informative presentation. You know, with everything that's come into the, you know, the news in the last 4, 5, 6 years has really brought, you know, the subject more to light, you know, than hidden in the closet from before. So it's, I think there's a big change, you know, just in the last 5 years of what's happening in the workplace and everywhere else. And we want to thank you on behalf of Toronto East Rotary for your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.